Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So on Monday, during Satya's keynote, we heard about how you can use Microsoft 365 to power a digital transformation at your organization. But what does that mean for your existing custom business processes that you're running in your apps today? Have you ever wondered how you can take enterprise workflows to the next level of automation by integrating them with Microsoft Cloud Services? I'm Jeff Sakowitz. This is Dan Kershaw.
Hello.
And we're here today to talk to you about how Microsoft Graph can act as the connective tissue between your apps and the Microsoft Cloud. So what is the Microsoft Graph? If we were to provide a textbook definition, we'd call it a unified REST API and a comprehensive developer experience for integrating with the data and intelligence exposed by Microsoft services. What does this actually mean? So it all starts with the user, represented by me in Graph. And this me represents the signed-in user. From the user, you can traverse relationships and see who the user's direct reports are. What people do they work with? Who are their contacts outside the organization? You can see what teams they're a part of, what groups they're a member of, and then you can see details about the organization they work in. You can also see what administrative units they might be a part of, what roles they're a member of, what privileges they have. And you can see other users in the organization. Then you can take it to the next level, and you can look at Office 365 data. You can look at what content they have in OneDrive and SharePoint. What sites are they using? What email are they sending? What calendar events do they have upcoming? You can also look at what applications they're using and what applications are being used in the organization around them. We also have support for partner APIs, where partners can manage organizations on behalf of their customers and our mutual customers. And finally, we're in the process of adding a whole bunch of more security-centric APIs to the graph, some of which exist today, some are coming soon, where you can see security alerts and threats that might be affecting the organization at the moment and react accordingly. Now, before I go any further, I want to dispel a couple popular myths about the graph. We often have people come to us and say, this sounds really great, but why is it read-only? I want to be able to provision users and create files. It is a full CRUD API as a general rule of thumb. So you can provision users, you can create groups, you can update group memberships, you can upload files, send mail on behalf of the user, register and manage devices, and more. Another thing people often ask us is, what does it mean now that you're sucking all the data out of Office 365 and Azure AD and putting it in the graph? What does this do? How does this affect security and compliance and privacy? It's not a concern, because we're not sucking data out of anywhere. The graph is simply a gateway to the data that already lives in EMS and Office 365. So when you're building apps against the graph, you automatically get to take advantage of all the awesome security, privacy, and compliance features of the underlying platforms that it's built on top of. We also have insights in the graph. In addition to the security insights I mentioned before, you can find out who people are working with, what documents are trending around them, whether they're out of office, things like that, and build smart apps. So how many of you were familiar with the graph before you came into this room? And how many of you attended Yina's awesome presentation yesterday? OK, so if you raised your hand for one of those two things, or both, you've probably heard us talk about the graph through the lens of Office 365. And there's a ton of awesome things you can do there. You can build amazing smart productivity apps. But what we're here today to talk about Graph through a slightly different lens. And this is the lens of EMS. Now, if you're not familiar with EMS, it stands for Enterprise Mobility and Security. And it's a suite of products that companies can use to manage their organization in the modern workplace and stay safe. This includes products like Azure Active Directory Premium, Intune, Azure Information Protection, Advanced Threat Protection, and more. Now, there's a ton of really great things you can do in the graph that let you squeeze every ounce of value out of EMS. But and I'm willing to bet that a lot of you either have EMS today or are thinking about moving to EMS. If you're not, don't worry. You don't have to run out the doors in the back of the room. There's still a ton of value you can get here, even if you have just one or two of the services that make up EMS. And another popular misconception is that people always come to us and say, I have Office 365, how do I get Azure AD? Well, if you have Office 365, whether you know it or not, whether you use it or not, you have a fully fledged Azure AD tenant. So a lot of what you're going to see in this presentation applies to you even if you're not using EMS today, even if you just have Office 365. You can use a lot of the Azure AD functionality. So now I'm going to pass it off to Dan to give you a little deeper view into Microsoft Graph.
Thank you, Jeff. Awesome. So you heard Jeff talk about some of the value of Microsoft Graph and what it can do for you. I'm going to drill in a little bit further to help you understand how you actually call the API and what that really looks like. One of the other things I wanted to add on top of what Jeff was saying was we also get questions when we've been on booth duty around, how much does this Microsoft Graph product cost? Do I have to pay for it? And it's like Jeff said, just a gateway to the data that you already have in those Microsoft services that you are already paying for. So you can treat it like another interface, like you already have a portal that you use to go to the data in Office 365. This is yet another interface, but it's an interface for developers to build great and awesome apps. So let's see what this looks like. OK, so I have Microsoft Graph API. It gives me access to a whole range of organizational data. And for my app, I can just go to one endpoint. So I don't have to worry about things like, hey, is this data in SharePoint? Or is this data in Intune? Or is it in Azure Active Directory and going to those individual endpoints? I just have to worry about one endpoint. And also, to call the Graph API, you need to acquire an access token. But there's only one access token. As part of acquiring an access token, you'd be requesting a level of access to Microsoft Graph, which an enterprise, either a user in an enterprise or an administrator, would actually authorize the access to Microsoft Graph. So it isn't as if you can just walk up to Microsoft Graph and just call it, or be worried if you're an administrator that any app can just get in. These apps still need to be authorized. So we do take security and privacy very seriously here. So really, when you're calling Microsoft Graph, you're looking at the entities behind Microsoft Graph in terms of users, groups, devices, messages, and we'll see more of that in a second. So when I'm calling the graph, I'm going to show you how we build up the URL to call the graph. If you were in Yina's presentation yesterday, you'll have seen this already. So you can daydream a little bit if you've already heard this. So we start with the root URL, and from there we make an HTTP verb. This is standard REST API. So if I'm posting, that's creating some data in the service. If you're doing patch or put, it's generally an update, and delete is removing data. And then from there, as we build this URL, we have a version. We have a preview version, which is on beta, and we have a generally available GA version, V1, which is where we want you to take production dependencies for your production apps. And next, in this URL, we have a resource. So this is the thing that you want to get access to. So whether it's drives, groups, devices, and much, much more. And next, because it's a collection of resources, you might want to identify a particular resource and get access to that particular resource, like Dan. And then you might want to see a particular property, or actually, Jeff showed you that lovely graph of relationships between different resources in the graph. And so here, this gives you a way to actually traverse those relationships within the graph. And then finally, we have a series of query parameters that let you customize the response, whether it's a projection through $select or filtering the results, or paging through a large collection of data. So going back to how you access the API and getting that access token, we have different app types and permissions. So first of all, we have the notion of getting your app being able to get access on behalf of a user. Generally, this is really an interactive scenario where a user is present and using your app interactively. And generally, these are mobile, web, and single-page apps. And the permission type we use for this is called delegated permission. And we have certain permissions that users can consent to if the data is within their scope, or things that must be consented by an administrator because they are wider scope things that generally are tenant-wide. And the permissions that the app gets is effectively the permissions that were granted to the application. So maybe it asks for the ability to read the user's mail or read the user's calendar, and the permissions that the user has to that same resource. And you see the intersection there. The other thing we have is getting access as a service. So in this case, it could be a service or a daemon like, let's say, some process workflow that you have running in the background, or maybe some email archival system, for example. And here we call this an application permission. This thing has broad access, so only an administrator can grant an application access to this data. And that's what you get. And so now I'm going to hand over to Jeff. Jeff is going to do a demo of the docs and our great tool, Graph Explorer.
Thanks, Dan. So I see a number of people out there taking pictures as soon as we put query parameters and things like that up on the screen. Don't worry about it. I mean, you can take as many pictures as you want. We don't mind. But I'm going to show you our documentation that has ample lists of all the different things you can do and all sorts of instructions for how to call the API. So you can come back to this later. All right, so first things first, graph.microsoft.com for all of your graph needs, including documentation. We'll show you some more stuff that lives here as well. So you're going to come to this landing page. You're going to click on documentation. And then you're going to wait for Conference Center Internet. We're on the demo Wi-Fi, too. Oh. That was something.
That's weird.
Here we go. OK, so then you're going to come here. You're going to have an overview of Microsoft Graph. You can read about it at a high level. And then on the left-hand side here, you're going to have all of this conceptual documentation. And the Zoom isn't working.
Control 1.
There we go. So you have all this conceptual documentation here, where you can learn about what it looks like to build your first app. You can learn about query parameters. Oh, sorry about that. You can learn about some featured scenarios. And then, yeah, under use the API, you can learn about all the different query parameters, how to traverse the graph, and navigate all the rich relationships that we have across all the various services that are connected through the graph. You can learn how to track changes with Delta Query and webhooks. And then you can drill down here into our entity reference documentation. Here's where we get into the nitty-gritty. So say you want to know how to add a member to a group. You can come in here. We'll talk about what permissions are required, ordered from least to most privilege. You should always use least privilege permissions when possible. Use permissions that just do what you need, nothing more, nothing less. And then you can actually drill in and see what a request looks like and what the response looks like. And this isn't very exciting of a response, but you'll see some more responses in a second. And then if you want to start playing with the graph without writing any code, you can come over to Graph Explorer. This is a tool that was built by our team, just like any app that you would build on the graph. So there's no secret sauce here. This is a third-party app built on top of the Microsoft Graph that makes it easy to get started. It also is a great tool as you're building your own apps in the graph. It's a great tool to come in here, play around, see what you can do, and also get your syntax right before you drop it in your code. It can be a lot easier, than debugging your code to just come in here and try requests out. So for this demo, let's assume that I'm building a company portal that my employees are going to log into every morning. And when they log in, I want to greet them by name. I want to show their profile photo in the top right-hand corner. And I want to show some specific content based on what department they work in and based on what groups they're a member of. And I also want to let them customize this page and let it show up in the theme and the color and the language of their choice, even if that language is different than what they use most of the rest of their day. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to run a query on /me, which gets the basic profile of the signed in user. And here you can see that my signed in user is Sarah. She's a product manager. I can see what office she's in, what her mobile phone number is, and her UPN and email address. I can also get her photo. Now I can put that in the top right corner and make this more personal. I could also see what documents are trending around her. And now I can come and I want to go beyond the basics. I can come in here and open up some more sample categories. And you can see all the various things we offer in the graph here. And I care about group membership information. So I'm going to go ahead and add that. And I can see all groups in the organization. But what I really want to know is what groups Sarah is a member of. So I can just run the member of query, which traverses to all the group objects and roles that she's a member of. I can also come in here and add a $select if I just want to see the names of the groups, for example. So anyways, Graph Explorer, really great tool for getting started and actually getting your queries right before you put them in your apps.
OK, switch
Back to Dan.
Thank you, Jeff. Yep, we're back. OK, so we're going to look a little bit more closely at some of the data. Jeff already showed you some of that. So Microsoft Graph, again, is that gateway to the data in your Microsoft Cloud services and really towards Microsoft 365. So not just the Office 365 data, but also EMS and Microsoft 365. And we also have a lot of new stuff that you can see in the pipeline that is currently in beta that will, in time, come to the GA version, the v1.0 version of Microsoft Graph. And we'd love you to play around with those things and give us feedback on our beta capabilities as well. So we're going to explore the data a little bit more. So let's, like Jeff said, start with the user profile. We already saw what Jeff did for Sarah. So you can query users and get the user's information and get their profile. You can get their photo, which comes back as a JPEG stream. You can find out who that user's manager is. You can find out who their reports are. Hey, Jeff, how come you have a prettier picture than me? And you can find out what groups they're a member of. And these are things that Jeff just showed you. But you can also go further than that, and you can go and traverse to the other data that is relevant for users. But what we're going to talk about is also the insights based on activities that are relevant to a user and the organization. So there are a whole bunch of insights that are calculated in the platform based on the activities that users perform. So for example, if I'm sending mail to Jeff a lot, or I'm in meetings with Jeff a lot, then he becomes an important person to me. So he shows up as a relevant person in the people API. So when I go and I query people, I will see Jeff near the top of the list because he's very relevant in my day-to-day communications. And this helps me to build now new sets of kind of people-picking APIs. So my people-picking API can be now very contextualized towards me and show me first the set of people who I really work with and allow me to search those sets of people first before I have to expand out to the rest of the organization. It also allows me to search for relevant topics as well based on conversations that I may have had with Jeff or others in my team. And you can see there's a series of other things like out of office and improved mechanisms for finding meeting times. We also have a series of Microsoft Graph capabilities as well. We've already talked about auth and the query parameters. We also have compliance as well. So we support conditional access. Jeff will talk a little bit more about that later. And we're also present in some national clouds as well. And finally, we have a series of different query patterns, which I'll go into in a minute. And if you want to build your apps against the REST APIs, fantastic. But we also have a series of client libraries as well. So it's up to you to pick the poison that you prefer. Actually, I guess you wouldn't really want any poison. But anyway, I wonder where that phrase comes from. So I'm going to go into some of these capabilities. So the first one I'm going to talk about is extensions. So extensions allows you as the app developer to add your own custom data, app data, to entity types that already exist, or resource types that already exist within Microsoft Graph. So I can, for example, extend the user entity with additional app properties, which may be profile data that is relevant to my application. And maybe I can tailor my experiences to have a consistent experience across different devices in terms of things like language and themes and colors by storing that extra app profile information on the user entity, and I can have an easy way to store it and access it. We have two types of extension. One is a very simple open extensions where you can just dump unstructured JSON data onto an object. And we have another which is called schema extensions where you actually go and define a schema, and this is strongly typed schema, and then that's used when you're trying to add additional data or extract data. And so it's all strongly typed, and that has additional filtering capabilities. On top of that, we also have notifications through webhooks and the ability to track changes through Delta Query. This becomes important for when you're building some of these automated workflow processes, and these things can really serve as the triggers for kicking off some of these automated workflows that we're going to talk about later. So for example, hey, this user got deleted because let's say they're being terminated. Well, there are a series of processes. Now I know that this user is terminated. Now I've received that notification that an automated workflow could do. And then finally, we have a way to batch requests. So you may, in a process, be doing a number of different requests, and you don't want to have lots of round trips back and forth to Graph. So we have a way that you can batch all your requests into one call. And as I said before, we have these support on these different SDKs, and we have samples and tooling on a variety of these. Please pay attention to which ones are GA and preview. And we're also previewing here the Azure Functions bindings as well, and I'll be doing a quick demo of that later. Node.js? I think Node.js was back there. If it isn't, we do have Node.js, right? That's why. Yep, OK. We couldn't fit more on the real estate. I would recommend you go to the website, that graph.microsoft.com, click on the SDKs, and you'll see the state of truth there.
You were mentioning the beta.
So we're going to try and take questions at the end. Is that OK? Thanks. So now I'm going to move on to some app scenarios. So first of all, we looked at what Graph can do for you, and we talked about how you can access the Graph. But now we're going to try and make it a little bit more real with some app scenarios of how you can apply Graph in your business for EMS and for Microsoft 365. So let's start with intelligent workflows and processes. So here you could have a series of workflows. You can imagine you have workflows around new hires, users changing from one group or one part of the organization to another part of the organization, or users being terminated. There are a series of processes that you can imagine take place in your organization today. And for some of you, maybe that's a place where you live today, and maybe that's too manual of a process and mistakes happen, and maybe your you're not fulfilling the compliance requirements that you really have in terms of making sure that users only have access to the data they need to have access to. So those are some of the workflows. Jeff will also go through a workflow around task assignment as well, so we'll see that later. Other things that you might have, we've heard from some various customers that group management is a key thing, and now with the ability in Office 365 groups to add for end users to basically create these groups and add users, there's more compliance and governance that folks want around this. But more than that, organizations have SOX compliance requirements. And so people in authority want to be notified on objects of interest when those objects change. So if a group gets updated with new members, they want to know about it just in case the wrong person was added within the organization to those groups. Also, we have business-to-business relationships. These are pretty key to most organizations, whether you have a supply chain, you work with vendors, or you just have partnerships. And so Jeff showed earlier, this notion of a partner organization, and basically being able to have your own line of business applications that run in your enterprise, and being able to, from within that application, invite folks from other organizations who you partner with, such that they can use their credentials from their organization, but to still be able to sign into your line of business application and be able to collaborate with you within your own line of business application. This is something that we generally term external or guest users, so you may have heard about that before. We also want to make sure that all our transactions are secure and that they're using conditional access policies to keep users and the organization safe. We're seeing, breach after breach recently. So, this is a very key piece of the puzzle. And so we're adding some changes around conditional access for Microsoft Graph that Jeff will talk about. And we also, in these workflows that I've talked about, I've really talked about some of the things that are part of maybe EMS, but there are also other things that you can do around leveraging some of the great things in Office 365 around find meeting times to create a smarter way to figure out how to create a meeting and find the resource or the room for your meeting automatically. And there's much, much more than this. So let's drill in a little bit further on some of these. So here's an example of a new hire onboarding. So a new hire gets created, something gets triggered, and now maybe you have an automated workflow that takes care of setting the profile, assigning licenses, setting the manager for that user. But more than that, it should also do things like assign devices for the user. So if you have Intune, you can now start provisioning mobile devices for that user. And then you want to go ahead and make sure that that user is authorized to access the right things. So assign them to a series of groups. That gives them access to maybe resources within your organization and to other apps that your organization has, including maybe other SaaS apps that you get from other vendors as well. And maybe assignment to Azure Active Directory roles if these folks are in a position of administrative authority as well. When you assign users to groups, this also can take advantage of any Intune mobile app management policies that you may have. And so now these users who get their mobile devices will automatically get the approved apps pushed down to their devices. And so, can this be done by the API? Sure. Well, we have a whole series of different APIs that enable this. Unfortunately, I don't have the APIs handy for the Intune pieces, but they are all fully documented in the graph.microsoft.com documentation as well. So I can assign users to groups. I can assign users to particular roles in the directory. And I'm going to show you a very quick demo of this using Azure Functions. Okay, so let's switch over here. Okay, so here I'm sitting in the Azure portal. I'm looking at a series of Azure functions that I've defined. So what I'd love to do is actually, let me show you creating a new function. The internet gods are wreaking havoc. Oh, there we go. All right. So there are a series of different templates that we can choose from in terms of functions. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to draw your attention to the fact that the Azure Functions Azure Functions team has integrated with Microsoft Graph. And we have a series of different templates for creating Azure Functions out of the box. So over time, there'll be more of these added. You'll notice that, unfortunately, user and group webhook handlers are not present in the list, but we will be adding those soon enough. So in the meantime, while we don't have an Azure function that allows us out of the box to integrate with Microsoft Graph for webhooks for users, what we're doing here is something a little bit artificial in terms of using an Azure function to create a user, and then we have, which is this particular one, and then and after creating the user, it puts it onto a queue, and then we have another function here that is actually pulling the user off the queue. So imagine someone creates a user, and now we see this new user, and now we can operate on that new user. And this, go away. This user can be added to a marketing group, for example, and maybe they can be assigned a manager. So that's what we're going to do here. So let me switch over here. What I'm going to do is create a brand new user. And fingers crossed, we have some internet and things will work. And everyone do their happy bear dances while we wait. Yep, there we go. So we've created a new user. So remember, it's created this user, it's putting it on a queue, and then I have another Azure function which is reading from the queue and performing a series of workflow tasks. Imagine that's your automated workflow that you're building. And here we see it. So the task is completed. It's created. It found the user, pulled them off the queue, and completed the scenario. So let's just double check that. Let's pull up this new user. Let's go to Jeff's favorite tool and Graph Explorer, and let's go take a look at users. So, oops, yeah, that was the right user, wasn't it? Oh, did I get logged out? Thank you very much, Jeff. Interesting. Okay. Frigging butterfingers. There we go. All right, let's try that again. Okay, there's our user, and now I can see what groups that user is a member of. And there we see the marketing department group that he got added to in that workflow. And we can also see who his manager is, and lo and behold, it's Sarah. So there we get to see how we can construct a workflow using Azure functions that can run in the background that can assist you with new user hire scenarios. We also have, oh, we should switch back. So we also, can have other scenarios as well, like if you're changing groups, we can track changes in terms of departmental changes, so that would be the department property on a user, and then that would kick off a whole bunch of flows around who the current manager is, setting the new manager, reauthorizing that user, so they need to be removed from certain groups, maybe added to new groups and roles. Again, behind the scenes, your policies, once they're added to new groups, can take care of pushing down new apps, removing apps from mobile devices, making sure that the user's compliant. But also, what work was that user doing? So now, we're tying in pieces of EMS and Office 365 and productivity pieces in Office 365 to also inform the manager, the previous manager, of what that user who's now transitioned was working on, so that they can actually take action on that. The only thing I'll point out here is, we have the whole series of APIs that are available through Microsoft Graph to really realize this kind of team change provisioning workflow, and that it's really kicked off by a Delta query to see an update to a user when department property has changed. So with that, the last thing I'm going to mention is, well, in that workflow, we had a user assigned to a role. Now, they'd be permanently in that role. If that user gets compromised, they're in an elevated privilege role, and that represents a real security risk for the organization. So what we have in in EMS and in Azure AD Premium is this thing called privileged identity management, which allows you to basically say, look, I'm going to remove those privileged roles from all users, and not be directly assigned to those directory roles, but be temporarily assigned to a privileged role. So now what happens is a user will request to be elevated temporarily to a role, privileged role, do their job, and then once they've done with their job, they'll come out of that privileged role. So in general, all users are just users, and only for a limited time are they privileged. This means that your attack surface area is much reduced with privileged identity management. And guess what? It's available in Microsoft Graph. So in that provisioning workflow, you could say, hey, we're going to stop pushing people into directory roles, but actually give them a privileged role assignment instead. Okay, over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Dan. So for this scenario, let's imagine that you're building a support ticket management system, and you want to do some automated smart routing of tickets. Graph can help here. So the first thing that you do, we're going to create a schema extension, because we want to store the support topic that a group of engineers are assigned to, what they specialize in. We want to store that on the group that they're a member of. So we're going to create a schema extension where we're going to store these support topics on each group. Then we're going to create a group for the engineers, and we're going to tag it with the support topic. So now the support topic attribute is a first-class attribute of the group object that I just created. So when I do my graph queries, I can get that support topic. I don't have to store it locally in my app. It's right there in Graph. Now I'm going to add all the engineers to the group. And then when a case comes in, I'm going to find an engineer. So first things first, I'm going to search for a group based on support topic. So I'm going to add, you can see that I have a dollar filter there. I'm basically doing a string search for a group where the name is equal to developer tools. So I know that I got a case where someone needs help on Microsoft Graph, and I'm going to find the developer support team. And then I'm going to look at the members, and I'm going to find an engineer on that team, and I'm going to assign them the case. Now I can take this a step further, and I can do some more interesting smart routing things here. Before I assign the case, I can check and make sure that the engineer is not out of office by looking at their mailbox settings and seeing if they have an automated reply set up. I could also do this on a periodic basis in the background, and I could automatically reassign cases if someone's out, so we don't leave any customers hanging. And then let's say a support engineer needs help on a case. It spans across many different pieces of technology, and they need someone else to help out in the support organization. I can use the People API to search for an authentication expert, and I can have them cut a subcase and get help as needed. So if it should become obvious that it's really important to make sure users are accessing cloud resources securely. And conditional access, which is one of the best features in EMS, helps a lot here. And you might be wondering how this applies to apps that are built through Microsoft Graph. And so what we've done is we've made it so that conditional access not only applies to Microsoft apps accessing Microsoft services, but it applies to third-party apps accessing Microsoft services. So when you call Microsoft Graph, because it's a gateway to data to existing cloud services, the conditional access policies that an administrator set in the organization will still apply when accessing resources through the graph. Now, we've got some changes coming here to help make this better and help make things more secure without adding friction for users. So today, we always abide by the policy of more secure first. So today, when you build an app against Microsoft Graph and conditional access policy set in the organization, we apply it to all resources in the graph. What we're doing is, and this happens at token acquisition time, what we're doing is we're moving the evaluation of conditional access policy down from the token endpoint into Microsoft Graph, so it'll only apply to the resources for which conditional access policy is actually applied. This means that if CA policy is set on Exchange, it'll only apply for apps that are accessing Exchange data through Graph. It won't get applied for apps that are accessing SharePoint data through Graph. So it makes sure that this policy applies to exactly the resources that it was meant to, nothing more, nothing less. What this means is developers will need to take an update to their apps, and the latest version of ADAL and MSAL will help with this. But what you need to know is there's going to be a new type of an HTTP 403 forbidden returned by the graph with an error code of insufficient claims. And you'll need to handle this in your apps and challenge accordingly depending on the scenario. And like I said, we won't dig into how you write your code for this now, but the latest libraries will help a ton with this. Check out our developer guidance at the link I have here. And we'll be communicating this out in a number of ways before it happens. No one's going to be caught unaware, but just want to put that out there. All right. So today we talked about how you can build apps that power automated workflows and enterprise-grade business processes through Microsoft Graph. These things can help you manage your enterprise and keep it secure. As next steps, go check out graph.microsoft.com, look at our docs, check out our samples on GitHub. If you have issues, talk to us on Stack Overflow. We monitor that regularly. And tell us about what you're building on Twitter. We love to hear about that. Also, there's still a ton of awesome sessions. A bunch of these are about graph development. A bunch of these are also about Azure AD and EMS and are about the underlying services that we talked about today. So definitely go check these out. Also, besides attending these sessions, try the Quick Start challenges. Come see us at the booth. We'd love to talk to you more. We'll have a few minutes for questions as well. And of course, please, we love your feedback. Please evaluate the session. We really appreciate it. And thanks for your time.
Thanks, yeah. Good job.
All right. So if you have questions, please come up to the mics.
So you were talking about Graph API beta, but it's 1.5 you mean, right?
I think you're talking about
Graph API beta is 1.5, right? Graph 1.5.
API version 1.5. I think you're talking about Azure Active Directory Graph API. And really, we want most people to start using Microsoft Graph as opposed to Azure Active Directory Graph, because Microsoft Graph gives you everything that Azure Active Directory Graph gives you and more, except for a few certain scenarios. And I know you use business to consumer scenarios, and for that you still need to use Azure Active Directory Graph. But we're working to migrate that functionality over to Microsoft Graph as well.
Dan, with the conditional access stuff that you just showed,
yes.
That's awesome. Is there going to be a part of the API where I can come in my experience and say, please tell me across this application for this user where that, like preemptively, where that conditional access is going to have already applied? Because it will just save me, I'm thinking about a mobile scenario, you don't want to do the data call across used data to go out just to be told, yeah, you're in conditional access. I'd like to be able to sort of say, hey, app, for Wes today, he's on mobile. What's his conditional access mask look like for his services, and apply that to my UX?
Yeah, so that is something that we have in our backlog that we want to do. We're not doing it, we're not tying it explicitly to that change, but it is something that we want to light up. Basically, so it sounds like you want to be able to programmatically see what CA policy has been applied for a user, or what CA policy will be applied, rather, what the proactively set policy is.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that is something, I don't have a date for it yet, but it is something that we want to do.
Because that'll be really important, because the whole paragraph, and certainly the stuff we do, is to bring together loads of different services into one place in the user experience. So I want to safely degrade that experience. I don't want to sort of go, oh, error, 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 just because of conditional access. I'd like to be able to say, hey, you're remote, therefore, completely change the experience. Maybe make the entire page just on the stuff that I can do.
Okay, yeah, that's really good feedback.
That makes sense. It's a good scenario.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
We started exploring the graph, and we just realized that our objective is to save email attachment to blob storage automatically. So, and then we found out that the graph doesn't have an event handler. Basically, when an email comes in, automatically process the email, find out if there's an attachment, and save it to blob storage. We can list last 10 email items, but we cannot trigger or invoke the method when the email comes in.
So depending on how much you want Graph to do for you, some of that may exist today, some of that I think you can achieve with something like Azure Functions. So what Graph does have is Delta Query and webhooks, so webhooks will proactively ping your app when there's new data. And then you can call back with Delta Query, and Delta Query is a way to say, show me what's changed, but don't give me all the data. So if you pair those up, what happens is we poke you and say, hey, there's some new data. You come back and say, what's changed? We just give you the new emails that exist in that inbox. Now, you will still have to do some work to extract that attachment and save it to blob storage. You may be able to completely automate this with Azure Functions.
Yep.
I think you can with the new, and they have a webhook binding for Outlook Mail. So I would definitely check that out. I think it's something you could achieve with Graph plus Azure Functions.
Yeah, we looked into webhooks, but the reason I'm asking you is just for best practices.
I see.
And also, we are using Logic, Azure Logic App.
Okay.
But we're trying to avoid Logic App. We want to try to do something for free, I guess.
I see. Okay. Yeah, you can't do it out of the box just with what Graph provides, but definitely use webhooks and Delta. That'll get you, most of the way there, and then you'll have to figure out how you actually want to extract the data and save it to blob.
I mean, you'll have to figure out whether you want to run that in your own service and pay for hosting that yourself, or pay for things like Azure Functions to do it in a serverless way. I mean, you'll have to work out the pros and cons of that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We have a hybrid environment. We have our on-premise ID syncing out to Azure AD.
Yes.
So how are the schema extensions going to work? The schema extensions as to adding out an attribute to the AD object schema. So is it going to come back to the on-premise AD and then update that, or is it only for Azure AD?
Yeah, so if you're talking about the schema extensions that we talked about today, those do not sync down from the cloud to on-prem AD. Yes. If that's something that you need, go ahead and go out to user voice and put that up there as a request, because I could see how it'd be useful.
Alternatively, you can create schema extensions on-premise in your on-premise AD if that's important, and then you can configure AD to connect to actually synchronize those.
Can I leverage
Microsoft Graph? Unfortunately, between AD Connect and Directory schema extensions and Microsoft Graph schema extensions, there are some differences. We changed the programming model in Microsoft Graph to make it easier for developers, but we still have something in the backlog that we still need to build that will allow you to address extensions that were created through AD Connect through Microsoft Graph. That doesn't exist today. Yeah, but again, like Jeff said, if that's important to you, please log a request on user voice, have other people voting on it, and we'll get it done.
A lot of things that you have shown, the automated ticket assignment, for example, So we have a different help desk product that we use. We wanted to leverage this API to add these additional schema extensions to the on-premise AD, and then
sync them to the cloud. Okay. So yeah, create an item in user voice.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
How about down there?
Yeah, we're looking to develop apps against Microsoft Teams. What's the process to get access to the beta API?
There is no process. If you already have Office 365 and you've enabled Teams and it's already running in your organization, you have it. Go call Microsoft Graph. Go call the Teams APIs that are part of Microsoft Graph.
And they're all documented on there?
They are documented, but they're documented under the beta reference. So if you remember, Jeff will show you. If you remember at the bottom of that whole reference section, in that reference section, right at the bottom there's a beta reference, and in there you'll find Microsoft Teams. Here you go, he'll show you.
So yeah, if you come all the way down here, so everything above here is ready for use in production apps. Everything down here is preview APIs in the beta version of Microsoft Graph. And then you will go right here, and there's all your Teams APIs.
So the one thing I will point out, the Teams API currently, again, it's in preview. It doesn't provide a creation API. That's something that those folks are working on, but it's not there currently. But you should be able to access your data that's in Teams.
Wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, does the Graph API provide an audit feature for groups? So if I wanted to pull a day's group audit field and see like whenever a user was created or deleted from that group for that day, is that possible with the Graph API?
Not yet. However, we are working on an auditing API. So that will surface through Microsoft Graph, and it would give you audit events like when users were added or deleted to groups, and actually anything in the directory.
I will say though, if you don't necessarily need it in audit log format, you could use Delta Query and or webhooks to call Graph, and it would tell you, it would give you basically a change notification that said user X was removed from group Y, user A was added to group B. And then you could, if you just need to take some action in your app, that might be totally fine. But if you need actual audit logs, like Dan said, that's coming.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
You literally just answered my question.
Awesome. 2 for 1. Love it.
Woohoo!
I want to know if there's any solution for the query information, such as when I post one request to Office 365 for mail, and if the response is very big, other example is I query mail very the frequency is very high. Is there some solution for that? You do that?
Throttling?
Yeah, throttling.
We do have throttling. Basically, what will happen is if you exceed the number of requests that you can make in a given time frame, we'll throw you a 429 error, and we'll include a retry after header. This basically says back off for X amount of time and try again. So best practice is to build all your apps, even if you don't expect to get throttled, always build your apps to handle 429s and back off for that amount of time, and then you should be all good.
See the
and there's documentation, yeah. So go check out the documentation. We have a whole best practice guide on throttling. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, it's a question from my team. So any plans to support inviting users via Graph Invitation API using service principal and without the need for end user to redeem the invitation ticket?
Okay,
because
so let me make...
It's only supported if you use explicit admin credentials, but we want to use application service credentials.
So let me make sure I understand this. So you're talking about the business-to-business invitation API. You're asking about whether you can automatically invite users without them having to go through the acceptance workflow.
Yes, exactly.
So you just want to add a guest user into the tenant, and you want to do it through the app using application credentials, not necessarily having a user present.
It can be guest user, or it can be a migration scenario, for example.
Let me put you in touch with, because I don't want to give you the wrong information. I know there's definitely a lot of conversation and work going on in that space. And I think actually there was a session on this that was going on at the same time as this one. So I can put you in touch with the program manager who drives that effort. Just come and see me afterwards.
Thank you.
Is there a way to pull logging information from like Skype call quality dashboard or from the user analytics using Graph? And also from the security and compliance center logs?
How do I get there? Oh. It's gone now.
So we have some audit report logs in preview in Graph. We have some Skype for Business reports. We don't have the compliance center ones that you mentioned. So what I'd recommend is just go and check out the beta reference that Dan's going to pull up here. And some of the stuff that you need might be here, but I don't think everything that you said we have yet. But we do have a goal to add more and more audit logs and reports in there.
So these are aggregated activity and usage reports, and they go across the Office 365 service. We'll be adding more of these types of reports, as well as what we call like audit events, which would be, you know, a stream of individual audit events that you'd probably get sent to a webhook.
Okay, thank you. And one other question. A lot of this seems to overlap with PowerShell. Is there going to be more functions here than in PowerShell, or are there going to continue to be development of PowerShell?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So PowerShell would be built on top of Microsoft Graph. And so things like the Azure AD PowerShell, or the latest set of PowerShell, some of those commandlets are built on top of Microsoft Graph. And the Intune PowerShell commandlets are exclusively built on top of Microsoft Graph. And in fact, there's a whole script library available on GitHub for that. Okay. And over time, I'm sure there'll be more commandlets that we'll build.
Okay, great, thanks.
Will the Microsoft Graph Outlook stuff replace the Exchange web service API?
So can you just say that again? I didn't hear it.
Will the Microsoft Graph Outlook bits replace the Exchange?
That is the idea,
That's
I
the
think.
plan,
yeah, that's the plan.
Okay.
So yeah, that.
I mean, is it just going to be the similar parallel APIs at the moment?
I think so. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't work in the Exchange team, so
Right.
for the Yina can probably help you with some of that. Some of the management aspects that you get in EWS aren't available yet through Microsoft Graph, but those scenarios around people's mailboxes and being able to do stuff with mail and calendar from my mailbox.
So
or
things
maybe
like the admin impersonation.
that kind of thing is not there.
No, it's okay.
If you come and see us later or talk to Yina, if you have any particular scenarios that are really important to you, we can feed those back to the Exchange team. Is that it?
All right.
All right. Well, thank you guys for staying the extra amount of time to ask questions, and thank you again.
Thanks, everybody.